Begin in time. Thank you everybody for being here. My name is Mariangela Palladino. I'm Dean of Research in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I'm stepping in on behalf of the Executive Dean of the faculty, who is indisposed today, so she could not be here. She sends her apologies. And I'd like to welcome all our guests on this special occasion today to celebrate the partnership between Keele University and Ironbridge. This is partnership with an important potential to see really some new forms of industrial revolutions. The humanities and the social sciences can make a really transformative contribution. And we must not forget, of course, geography and geology, environmental studies, as well as astrophysics, as subjects and researchers who have mobilized for this. This is a truly interdisciplinary effort, and these are only the first steps that we are taking. So it is my pleasure to welcome you here at Keele, especially if it is the first time, and to see many more visits. And I understand Keele will then visit Ironbridge. Thank you also for the beautiful gifts on the table. And without any further ado, I'll hand over to Professor David Amigoni and the rest of the panelists. Welcome again.
Thank you so much, Mariangela. Are we ready to start with? We are. That's great. Well, a very warm welcome to Keele University for those of us who join us here in the room, and also for those of us who are joining us online. This is a KISI and ILAS presentation on the which celebrates the inauguration of a partnership with Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust. The theme of our roundtable this evening is Ironbridge, innovation and imagination, and we're thinking about industrial memory as a global challenge. My name is David Amigoni. I'm Professor of Victorian Literature here at Keele University, and I also direct the Institute for Social Inclusion, and also collaborate with lots of partners locally, including Ironbridge Museum Gorge Trust, on Keele Deal culture. I'm just going to go around and ask the members of the panel to introduce themselves, and then I'll give a bit of an overview of how the session will work.
Hi, I'm Ben Anderson. I'm a senior lecturer in environmental history, and amongst a series of disparate research projects that don't seem to really have any connection to each other, one of the things that I'm really interested in is how ex-industrial sites become tomorrow's heritage sites. I tend to work a lot on sites which are only just becoming decommissioned, so the sort of the latest batch, if you like, of deindustrialisation. I've worked on power stations, coal-fired power stations, and oil-fired power stations in the Trent Valley and on the south coast. And actually, just this morning, I inducted, is the word you use, a new postdoctoral researcher who will be working on the industrial heritage of Dounreay nuclear facility in the far north of Scotland.
Hi, I'm Mike Novell. I'm the Industrial Heritage Support Officer for England, working out of the Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust. My role is to provide support and training and do some research on the current issues around the 400 or so industrial heritage museums and sites that there are in England. It's part of Ironbridge's sector-leading role in supporting those industrial heritage sites. My background is in industrial archaeology and industrialisation, so I'm particularly interested in the impact of industrialisation and ideas about memory and place and community links to those sites, which comes up a lot when you're dealing with 400 or so organisations who preserved everything in England, from big power stations to pumping stations to wind and water mills and all sorts of manufacturing sites in between.
Hi, my name's Abby King. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Ironbridge, and my job there is to make sure that everything runs cohesively and that we tell the right stories to our visitors that are visiting us.
Hello, I'm Kerry Morgan. I'm Professor of Place Writing and Geohumanities here at Keele University. So that means I work on other people's published place writing, looking at representations of space and place, as the name suggests. I also write my own. The geohumanities might be an unfamiliar term for some of you, as as the term suggests, it means bringing together approaches from geography, notably human and cultural geography, with arts and humanities approaches and methods. So I often make art with other people outside of university. I'm from a deindustrial area myself, if you know anything about British accents. I'm from the South Wales Valleys. I have a personal history to an industrial or deindustrial disaster, and I've worked on and I'm working on projects that are related to place and published in new forms of place writing, but also related to deindustrialisation.
Thank you very much to all members of the panel for their introduction. Because I'm a literature professor, I'm going to kick off by reading from a book. And I'm going to think a little bit about what it means to remember something. I'm going to focus on James Naismith, the inventor of the steam hammer, who set off from Manchester in 1830 to visit Coalbrookdale and industrial regions in the West Midlands. And he published his autobiography in 1886. So there's a gap, good number of years between the publication of the autobiography and the memory. But anyway, Naismith remembers leaving Manchester, taking a picturesque route down through Wem, Whitchurch, and past the Wrekin to arrive at Coalbrookdale. And he sees the bridge. We're going to find out, of course, that Ironbridge, the gorge, is much more than the bridge. But he sees it, and he notes its spectacular significance as the first innovative structure in that form to be produced in the world, in a world of industrialised newness. He then goes along to Coalbrookdale and sees the iron masters, the iron workers in action. He's struck by their remarkable capacity for collaboration and improving their standards by kind of shared working practices. It's a very, very positive visit to Coalbrookdale. But then he goes on to Wolverhampton and he sees a rather different image of an industrial environment. The Black Country, he says, is anything but picturesque. The earth seems to have been turned inside out. Its entrails are strewn about. Nearly the entire surface of the ground is covered with cinder heaps. And then he goes on to look at the living things, well, the once living things that populated the environment. The emblem of vegetable death, he remarks, in its saddest aspect. So a terrible image of the kind of effects wrought on the environment by industrialisation, at the same time as celebrating the immense skill of the workers. And I'm really struck that he goes on to see another foundry in action at night in Wolverhampton, and he's really struck by it. He says the workmen within seemed to be running about amidst the flames in a pandemonium. What a word, great word, pandemonium. And you inevitably think, I think, of 2012 and the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games. How was that portrayed by Danny Boyle and his co-writer Frank Cottrell Boyce? It was portrayed as, you remember the title, Pandemonium. The great chimneys rising out of the ground, the great energy, but also the ravaging of the environment. So this is a kind of a moment from the 1830s that I think still lives on in our popular memory of the Industrial Revolution. That's just by way of a brief introduction, just to frame the event a bit. But I'm now going to pass on to Abby, who is going to tell us what Ironbridge Gorge, the Ironbridge Gorge site is about.
So I only have a couple of minutes and I could literally talk for an hour on what we get up to. So this is very much a snapshot of Ironbridge. So this is the Ironbridge. This is what people think Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust is. That's not it at all. That's a snippet of the things that we are associated with. This opened in 1781, and it was the first cast iron bridge crossing the River Severn. This is what we actually are. We are 10 museums across the whole of the gorge. We can talk about things from the original old furnace that Abraham Darby started, right the way through to a tile factory at Jackfield and the tar tunnel. We talk about the whole of the industries in the area and the things that came about because of the ironworks in Coalbrook Down. We also look after 35 scheduled monuments and, most importantly, 2 graveyards. Our collections, a massive part of who we are, have over 400,000 items in our collections. This is from tiles to our Boy and Swan fountain to documents and archives creating the story of the Industrial Revolution out of Coalbrook Dale. So we're more than just a sum of our parts. We're more than the buildings we look after. And it's really important that people know this about us. The other thing we are is our people. We have over 200 paid members of staff working for IGMT and 198 active volunteers. And you can see that they work in all of the areas, from our archaeology, demonstration, maintenance, and so much more. And we're an important part of the local economy. So we're not as we were in the local economy, but we're still a really important part of the local people's lives. We're employing most 16-year-olds in the area. And this is who we are. We are the most extraordinary district in the world, as said by a visitor in 1837. And our place in the world now is to tell people the stories and the relevance of how they are today. Everybody who has something that's manufactured in their houses came because of what was started at Coalbrook Dale. And it's something we take very seriously and moving forward to our future generations.
Abby, thank you so much for that. I think that gives everybody a really good sense of what a fabulous site it is, and of course a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So I'm just going to go around now and just briefly ask the panellists to just give a couple of remarks, really, to think about how they want to kind of frame their discussion. So I'm going to start with Kerry. Kerry, could you maybe just...
I think actually Ben is
starting point. Okay, so in a sense I've kind of been asked to talk a little bit about just transitions, because I think that's one of the ways in which I tend to frame the research that I do around decommissioned sites. And actually I started thinking about this, I started thinking about Stoke-on-Trent and the various different industries that exist in Stoke-on-Trent. And recently we've had a bit of a sort of mini revolution in heritage in Stoke-on-Trent, partly because of the throwdown and the Peaky Blinders coming to visit, and supported by three dedicated heritage sites to the pottery industry. But of course, the building we're in now doesn't have very much to do with that at all. The Sneed family were much more interested in investing in coal and iron, the 2 other industries associated with Stoke-on-Trent, of which actually very little remains. I mean, there's a vast colliery that I've done some research on, admittedly. But aside from that, much of the landscape of coal has disappeared in the north part of Stoke-on-Trent. And Shelton Bar is all but invisible as you drive through the centre. And I'm not sure how much of that is an accident or down to the existing and still existing pottery industry in Stoke-on-Trent. But it does tell us that heritage is about both memory and forgetting. It's about remembering and forgetting. It's about remembering different versions of the past, giving them legitimacy and authority, and giving different people's versions of the past legitimacy and authority. And so heritage does become a political project in that sort of sense. It's one that we need to be careful of. And it's one that I think for me can support a just transition by enabling people to take charge of their pasts and express their pasts in a particular way, to be proud of the pasts that they feel that they're connected to, and therefore feel that they have a stake in what might come next in the future. I'm not suggesting that we can necessarily remember everything. I don't think that's possible. And remembering one thing is always necessarily about forgetting something else. But we can make choices about what and how we remember things. So that's the first sort of part that I wanted to talk. I thought sort of set of points I wanted to make. But the other aspect of where I think places like Ironbridge can really lend a hand is that any industrial site like Ironbridge is necessarily a representative of at least two major transitions. The one that created the site, the Industrial Revolution, the birth of industrialisation that Ivy was talking about as well, and also as a site of decline. Ironbridge at some point stopped producing iron and underwent its own transition along with much of the rest of the country. And how that process was managed, how Ironbridge became the heritage site that it is today, the research that surrounds that, the collections that surround that can tell us a lot about perhaps what voices are missing from our own understanding about what a just transition might be. And about how people of the time and at different times might have remembered the pasts and the livelihoods that were disappearing before their eyes.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ben. Ben, that's interesting when you're talking about, in a sense, selective memory, I suppose. What do you think? What do you think propels the selectivity? I mean, I guess it's varied, but
so one of the things that's interested me over the last sort of 2 or 3 years has been the ways in which these memories change as generations change, so that each generation creates its own sense of what that past might represent and what that past might mean to them. An understanding heritage in a sense, in a dynamic way, as something which is recreated by succeeding generations, rather than something which is necessarily static for a heritage site to kind of distribute amongst a set group of people. So I think that's one of the things. I mean, I think there are political impetuses that come together to remember some things more than others within particular sites, and sometimes it's as simple as like I say, in the case of Stoke-on-Trent, there still being an extent pottery industry in the same way as there isn't a coal industry to support a particular version of what that city might be. So I think that there are a number of ways of answering that, but I don't think it's all about top down. I think it's also about how people's understanding of heritage is changing at a local and individual level.
Thank you very much, Ben. So I'm going to move on now to, having elevated Kerry mistakenly in the order, I'm going to come to her proper place in the discussion now. Kerry, do you want to give us your take on this particular event?
Yes, thanks. And this will make sense as why I demurred when I was asked to speak first. So what I am particularly interested in is, I suppose, many of the questions that Ben brought up, but also particularly about a diversity of heritage, a diversity of memory. Obviously, heritage sites can also become sites of contestation, as we know from recent events. So there's a real challenge, isn't there, to sort of think about heritage sites as ones that can allow for an openness of memory, allow for that contestation to take place, not allow for one set of more powerful voices to dominate. And also I'm very interested in a kind of similarities and differences around the world with respect to deindustrialisation. We know deindustrialisation is a global phenomenon with local specificities. I myself am a Quebec specialist. I'm working on a project on Quebec's literary heartlands right now. I'm looking at a region in southeastern Quebec called the Eastern Townships in English, l'Estrie in French. And through close readings of things like murder mystery novels, literary fiction, chick lit and other things, there's traces of this industrial heritage, an industrial past in that region, which is almost unheard of outside it. So even in Montreal, which is right next door, there's almost no recognition about this industrial history, and yet within the region itself, it's very important. So I'm interested in how we draw out some of these suppressed or forgotten histories, what the global similarities and differences might be between various heritage sites, and also how through participatory events, through kind of activities that we can undertake with people outside of universities as well as within them, what kind of future memories we can create and what kind of forms those might take. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Kerry. Thank you so much. Do you want to say, we'll be coming back to explore this a bit further anyway, but do you want to just say a little bit more about that idea of future memory? Because that's an interesting concept.
Well, it sort of links, I mean, people can probably tell that Ben and I have worked together before, but it sort of links to some of the things that Ben was saying about, you know, different generations having different memories. It's also kind of trying to creative writing and other arts practices obviously can project into the future, into an imagined future in a way, can't they? I mean, as can all scholarly endeavour, I suppose, but I think the arts can speak to a broader range of audiences, perhaps, than more academic study. So it's about trying to think and envisage ways of. I always work on place. So place-engaged memories that ensure the places are meaningful for the future generations, that are not necessarily all about loss. I mean, we know that within this region, loss is a strong narrative in relation to the former industries because of socioeconomic hardship and other factors that Stoke and many other regions, including my home region, have experienced. And whilst it's important to acknowledge those memories, we also have to think about hope as a radical, entity, and to try and generate hope.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Kerry. I was going to move on to Mike now. Mike, I mean, people love objects as well. So I mean, I guess that is one of the things that that you curate, that you protect.
Absolutely. You know, Ironbridge is probably the biggest industrial heritage museum complex in the UK. As we've heard, has got 400,000 plus objects, and that presents some real challenges in how we curate that material, challenges in how we interpret it as well, and also the role of that material in explaining industrialisation, the start of industrialisation, the end, and the consequences as well. So that's particularly relevant, I think, in quite a rapidly changing environment. You know, we're coming out of COVID. We've had the cost of living crisis. We have net zero targets to meet. So Ironbridge is very typical, but also exceptional in terms of the collections we hold. And what we do at Ironbridge could well be an exemplar for the other 400 organisations in England, 200 organisations in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland that deal with industrial heritage through museum displays and curation. And just to sort of pick on two extremes, I suppose. One is how we bring people back into our sites post-COVID. With the cost of living crisis, trying to encourage people to come and look at our sites when they've got so many calls on their time and their money. And how do we make ourselves relevant to this current generation? And that sort of cycles back to thinking about industrialisation. The origins of industrialisation in the gorge are actually partly bound up with the use of natural resources. Water power was central to the early iron making in the gorge. It ran the bellows that heated up those first iron furnaces in the late 16th and 17th centuries. And the first steam engine in the gorge in Coalbrookdale actually recycled water, pumping it up the valley to a reservoir so that could run the machinery at the furnaces. And then at the other end, you've got in the late 19th, early 20th century, you've got a chap called Thomas Parker who grew up in Ironbridge, and he in the mid 19th century he actually invents and builds in Wolverhampton one of the very earliest electric cars. So you've got sort of the history of Ironbridge is full of this kind of innovation, and from my point of view, I think we can talk to Keele about how we use that to interpret Ironbridge and its various histories and its various stories to the current generation where we are at the moment in the third decade of the 21st century. We're pretty much in the middle of the 21st century, and the 21st century is really a very different beast to even the 20th century, and we can see that physically in Ironbridge just from the threat of climate change. We have buildings that were built to be flooded once in a decade, which are now regularly flooded, for instance. And that's a consequence of industrialisation, but it's also a consequence of us being where we are in the landscape, using that water supply. So what we can learn at Ironbridge are ways of adapting to the 21st century, talking to new audiences, talking about memory and place and what that means in an post-industrial context in a place like Ironbridge, and perhaps using some of that experience to really support those hundreds of organisations and hundreds of sites in Britain that go to make the world's first industrial society. And that, of course, is why we have 10 World Heritage Sites around industry in the UK. It's the largest concentration of industrial World Heritage Sites on the planet, and that's because of our role, for good or and for bad, in promoting the industrialisation phenomenon around the globe.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Mike. And I'm just interested in that in that challenge that you have around the relationship between a long history of engineering innovation and what that can mean for kind of social innovation, I guess, for everybody now who engages with the site and also with the idea of industrial heritage. I don't know whether you want to just reflect a little bit more on that, and then I was going to ask all the rest of the panel if they could think a little bit about that question.
One of the things I think is very obvious at Ironbridge is that most people are not making things who visit the site. You know, that immediacy of coming from a family who work in factories has gone, but 2 or 3 generations behind, people would have been doing that. So there is still a familial link, if you like, between the traditions of manufacturing and seeing manufactured products in Ironbridge. That's partly where I think the sort of the hundreds of thousands of objects we have could be really very useful, sort of reminding the current generation that the mass manufacturing of objects comes from a place like Ironbridge, and trying to connect with the personal as well. One of the great things about looking at an object is that it is very personal. Mm-hmm. It's a lot more personal than a big steam engine, although they're fantastic as objects, especially when they move. It's more immediate perhaps than some of the buildings and the iron furnaces we have. So I think those objects as a way of talking about memory and connecting with the past is something we should really think seriously about.
Yeah. And Gabby, did you want to just add to that in terms of, because you talked a lot about how you tell the stories to kind of...
So we tell the story differently depending on who's visiting. So our school children will make bricks, they will dip candles, they will visit the sweet shop. It's about passing on other people's nostalgia, really, to the children, and explaining to them that no, lots of people don't work in factories anymore, but this is where we came from, this is where we started. And we did a horrible histories at at half term, and we gave everyone a card, and they had to go and find that person and talk about that person's job and how actually it wasn't great, but that's their past, and so that's kind of how we tell our stories.
That's great, thank you.
I mean, it does feel to me like we talk about sort of dipping candles, but one of the challenges, I think, facing a lot of industrial sites, so I think Ironbridge, including having been to this hill and seen some of this, is that one of the things that I think is more difficult to retain is the heritage of skill.
Yes.
And that, for certainly in the coal mining industry in North Staffordshire, actually in many ways that's one of the really important things that people take a lot of pride in, and that have a real passion for maintaining, right? So I think it's partly a role of heritage sites to pass on some of those skills and to create a new generation of people who'll be able to develop some of those skills and perhaps develop them into something that might actually be useful beyond the heritage site.
We work with the Heritage Red List of skills.
Yeah.
So things like our pipe maker at Broseley Pipework, he's one of the only people still making clay pipes in the country. So that's also a role that we take on to keep moving forward so they don't get forgotten.
And this is not just about nostalgia. There's a really hard-headed economic need for these skills shortages. Britain has hundreds of thousands of industrial period sites that are protected in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and England. We have an acute shortage of bricklayers and thatchers and people who can cast iron to keep these buildings whole and safe, and so there's a real opportunity there to create a new economy around those key craft and heritage skills.
And of course a lot of them are utilising local materials. I mean, I wouldn't like to vouch for the carbon credentials of some of these skills, but certainly several of them are going to be genuinely carbon efficient, and those are the sorts of skills that are perhaps are going to be more useful than we think in the future. So we'd lose them at peril.
Yeah, and the ones that aren't, you find ways to make them better.
For sure.
Yeah, I think that question about skills heritage is really important, and forms of labour, because those forms are also people's legacies, aren't they? And although we've talked a little bit about nostalgia up until this point, nostalgia isn't just a negative thing. This isn't my point. Quite a few theorists have written recently about forms of radical or hopeful nostalgia. So sometimes when people are nostalgic for forms of labour attached to manufacturing or attached to coal mining, I mean, I'm from a coal mining region. Nobody wants their child to be a miner. It is a dangerous and deadly job. Everybody wants their child to be educated, do a job where they sit in a safe office all day, right? That's what people want for their children. However, they have a pride in the mining skills and labour that they carried out. And that pride is also about working conditions, about the camaraderie of working, about having decent working conditions, paid holiday. I think those memories are really important to retain as well in an economy when we have 0-hour contracts, for example.
So this has been a really interesting development in the discussion, because I think you're making the link between ideas of celebrating and preserving, but also extending heritage, and also the kind of notion of civic pride. I mean, is that something that industrial heritage can really help to develop? And that pride is open to many kinds of relationships. It's not just a top-down pride, I hasten to add. Is that something that you would be interested to reflect on a bit?
I'll take that one. Okay, I'll take that one. There's a really strong local sense in many parts of the UK about the role of local industry in placemaking and in identity. You take away the industry, you take away the identity of the local community quite often. But you can see this particularly where local communities fight to save a particular building or a particular piece of the landscape, and reusing industrial buildings for the local community, in the local community, either as converting them into houses, apartments, converting them into retail and shops, giving them a new use, is one of the key ways in which we transmit that legacy. One of my favourite reuses is a stationary steam engine in Clitheroe, I think it is, for a cotton textile weaving mill. The stationary steam engine is there preserved as an object in a wine bar. So you get wine bar and restaurant as a sort of massive feature. So that's a very particular way of reusing the heritage, but also in terms of re-engaging with Clitheroe, which is now back to being a market town, which it was in the medieval period, connecting with its sort of 150, 200 years use as a cotton textile town. So there are lots and lots of examples of that, and I quite often deal with local communities and groups who want to save a particular building and find ways of reusing it. And the best way to save a building, an industrial building, any heritage building, but particularly industrial buildings, is to give it a reuse and to plug it back into the local community, and to get the local community on board so that they can take back ownership of it. Both, not just physically, but also in an ideas way, in an attachment way.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I noticed that throughout that the word civic was, but I in a sense I agree with its absence, because I think, not to completely contradict you, David, but the word, please contradict me. The word civic suggests a relationship with state institutions and a certain level of placemaking, which is already authorised by state structures. And I think actually industrial heritage can play that role, but it can equally provide alternative loci of attachment. It can help to provide communities with something around which they can structure their layers of feeling, which isn't necessarily linked to a particular political or institutional structure external to that community. So it can also challenge, I think, a particularly defined version of civic pride. And I think so it is about placemaking. I think the other thing I would potentially say is that I think sometimes a heritage site can, in a sense, kind of remove heritage from its more communal setting, or remove those memories from a communal setting. And I think that sense of communities taking ownership of it is a means to trying to combat some of those issues around sort of partitioning off heritage from the rest of a community and saying, okay, this is the past and the rest of it is not. And in places like Lightstoke, or anywhere in the country really, the heritage of coal mining isn't just in the collieries. It underwrites people's houses. For ex-miners, it's in their bodies. The heritages go much further than that. And because these sites weren't purely an economic centre in and of themselves with no relationship to their hinterland, when they underwent transitions, everywhere else did as well. And so the heritage of these sites ripples out. The histories of these sites rippled out as they came into being and as they closed, and losing sight of that relationship with the hinterland, I think is a real problem for any heritage site. So we need to find a way of creating that connection and keeping it live as the heritage site develops.
Brilliant, thank you. I love that idea of rippling heritage ripples as well. I think that's great. Abby, Kerry, did you want to give us some reflections?
I was just going to say the pride, is also a very loaded and contested term, and there've been some very interesting calls for papers in one of the big geography conferences that is held every September, looking at different kinds of pride, like queer pride. Just one example, and it's kind of maybe complicating some of those top-down notions of pride, which I think are really important. Also really important in thinking about whose heritage is retained, who gets to voice that heritage, allowing for a multiplicity of voices.
And I think, as Ben was saying, it's not just about the industrial, it's about the families, it's about the closing of the working men's clubs, the bands, everything that went with them. And we've done work this year to kind of tell the whole story, not just the little bit between the hours of kind of 8 and 6. I think that's really important.
That's great, thank you. I'm going to just remind everybody online now that we're moving towards the point where we'll take questions. So if I can encourage you to put your questions into the chat, I'm sure you've been doing that anyway, but if I can just remind you of that opportunity. Tim Lustig, who's the director of ILAS, is going to be fielding those questions, sending them out to the panelists, and we'll also look forward to hearing from those of us in the room as well who want to ask some questions. So we're moving towards the questions session now, and I'm just going to invite the panelists just to maybe just spend a couple of minutes identifying something that they feel we haven't talked about enough so far, or making the odd concluding comment that will take us into those questions. So, Ben, do you want to kick off?
I mean, I think when I first came to Ironbridge, as you say, laid out, Abby, that sense of the kind of the multiplicity of sites, because I didn't get a chance, it's perhaps my own fault, to visit each of those sites. I suppose one of the things I've wondered is how far do you see the history of Ironbridge as a single unified narrative, and how far do these sites each tell their own story, which sometimes might even conflict with one another. So I wonder if I get an idea about how the narrative structure, if you like, within Ironbridge works.
So we kind of call ourselves the Valley of Invention. So, and within that, it's where great minds change the world. So if you go to the Tile Museum, we will tell you the story of that, but also the various links on the River Severn to everything else. So everything is individual, but also everything is connected, and that's really quite important to us when we tell our story.
That's great, thank you. Mike?
For me, one of the things we've really only touched on is people's industrialised lives outside of that 9 till 5, which at Ironbridge we do tell in a variety of ways, but it's as much a part of the industrialisation experience as it is about the working life. So it's getting across to people that the industrialisation is about changing your whole life. It's one of those great step moments in humanity, like it's equivalent to us learning to speak, learning to write, living in towns and cities. It's that big. And I think sometimes, because we're the first industrial society, we're a bit shy about that particular monumental impact that industrialisation has. But you can see it on a domestic level, literally on a domestic level, in some of the displays we have at Bliss Hill or at the Pipe Museum, where you can see how your domestic life and your work life merges together in this industrialisation experience. So for me, I'd like to see more of that. Explore more of that experience.
Brilliant, thank you. Abby?
For me, it's about what does the future hold? As we go into kind of the new technology and realities that we're heading to, it's going to be more and more industrial archaeology, industrial sites. Where do we go? Where do we say, no, that's not worth saving, and what is worth saving?
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Thanks for that. Kerry?
Well, from our discussions today, what I'm really interested in a couple of things. One is what various disciplinary approaches can bring. As soon as we were talking before we came into this room about Ironbridge and the bridge itself and being cast and so on, and I immediately started thinking of Michael Ondaatje's wonderful novel about the building of modern-day Toronto in the skin of a lion, which is a very different context, but it's also about building a huge bridge. So I'm interested in that. You know, we know that that novel is also about work, about preserving different kinds of labour and celebrating different kinds of labour. So what can creative writing, for example, do to do some of that heritage work? And I'm also I'm interested in how, sort of following on what you were saying, really, Abby, about how, because this is something I'm wrestling with a little bit in the project I'm working on now. I'm trying to design an audio walk, a downloadable audio walk that'll both speak to the place in which it's set, the broader region in which it's set, but also that people can listen to enjoy in a completely different context. So how do we design some of these interactive digital activities that can be both very site responsive but speak to other places in the world?
Yeah, because I suppose to sort of answer your question of what we save, I mean, I think maybe Mike will contradict me here, but I think there's been a for me there's a sense in which the answer to what we end up saving is, well, it's a bit of a last man standing approach. Probably when it comes to cooling towers, I'd be a bit surprised if we end up with no cooling towers anywhere in the UK once coal disappears. But I don't know, I'm not sure there'll be more than one.
I suspect that's probably right.
And it'll probably just be the last one that's there, right? And so, so on the one hand, I wonder if there's a better way. On the other, I wonder if the opportunities provided by the digital environment, which we've not yet thought about, to try and save some of the memory and an experience of some of these sites, not instead of the last man standing approach. I think the physicality of some of these sites is really important to maintain somewhere. But in addition to some of that physical industrial archaeology, what can we use in digital terms to help us to understand what not just that one cooling tower might have been, because on its own I don't think it gives us a full impression of what the Trent Valley looked like, right? But in order to give us that sense of what I suppose I might call the landscape of the Great Acceleration, or the landscape of sort of post-1945 consensus, however we want to characterise the period, what that landscape might have looked like. Because I think that landscape is just about to disappear, and it's one that actually quite a lot of people have quite a lot of love for. So I think that's just one example. So I think there are some real opportunities for thinking more expansively about what a digital offering of heritage might lead to.
There are some deep, just to add to that, there are some deep roots at Ironbridge that could do that, because we have some early examples of digital heritage in the oral histories that the museum has undertaken since at least the 1980s. It's got a large collection of oral histories that we're in the process now of revisiting and thinking about how we can use and how we might make those more available to a wider public. Think of that as the digital archaeology of the mind, and that's the kind of thing we're talking about here with the new technology of the 21st century.
That's brilliant. I want to take this opportunity to thank the panellists for this phase of the discussion as we move into question, and perhaps we could all join before we move into the questions and thanking them for their reflections. But we now do have some time for questions. Given that we've got a lot of people online, Tim, do we have any online questions coming through?
Yeah, we do. Thank you very much, David. So there's a question from Kieran, who's joining us from Teesside University, so obviously an area with its own industrial history and industrial memory. And Kieran's question is, I was wondering if the panel could say something on the relationship and connection between work, social fabric / community and heritage, and what that might mean for the future of the gorge and the surrounding areas.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Kieran. Who wants to kick off with that one?
Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, a lot of our families that still live in the gorge and in the surrounding areas came from the industrialisation that we now look after as part of our heritage. And as I said earlier, we've changed our place in the economic climate of Ironbridge. So we employ 200 people from the area, and we take it really seriously, the supporting and moving forward, so that our standing is just as important as it was 200 years ago. It's just in a really different way. And I think that's quite an important thing for other sites to kind of take and run with as well.
I mean, I think it's a really difficult question, because if we're talking about, especially if we're talking about the workplaces of the 20th century, they were very much bound up with the social fabric of the communities in which their employees worked, in a way which I'm talking in general terms here. I know there are plenty of exceptions in a way which I don't think necessarily workplaces are today.
No.
And what that meant was that those workplaces, when those workplaces closed, the social fabric which had built up around them also lost its support structure. And a part of that is about the collapse of nationalisation. We could talk about a whole load of history connected with that. But it does mean that some of those heritage sites, when they came into being, and when they could be maintained, and that was also a critical problem. They could provide, in some cases, to a certain extent, a replacement for some of that social fabric. I wouldn't say that they can necessarily ever offer a full replacement, but I think they did end up performing that role in a variety of in a number of cases, and as you say, continue to perform that sort of social fabric role, and can continue to perform that social fabric role as they develop, and the groups that once worked in these places, become older and can become replaced by their children. So I think there is a role there, but I don't think we should pretend that heritage sites on their own can fulfil that role of replacing those lost social fabrics.
Okay, thank you. Tim, were there any other questions online? We'll take one more question from online, and then we'll just see if there are some questions from within the room.
There certainly are, David.
Oh,
So
right, okay.
there are three questions that came in all at 6:47 p.m. And I'll try and sort of edit them, if I may, just together, and then perhaps invite the panel to respond to the ones that they think are appropriate. So a question from one of my colleagues, Rebecca Leach. I'll shorten it, but she says, I'm really interested to know, or even research with college, whether handled iron objects carry some of the same sense of frozen magic that pottery does. And that's from Rebecca. Then from Simon, do the panel consider society to already be sufficiently engaged or even aware of heritage and the purpose and the value of it? That's again edited down a bit. And then a question from one of our PhD students, Amy Blaney. So she's interested in what the panel have said about cultural memory. Do they feel that the industrial past is romanticised or mythologised in any way? So a group of questions there to prompt further discussion.
Who wants to kick off?
I'll do the mythology one.
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Yes. If you look at the way industrial heritage has been dealt with in the UK, post-World War II, there were sites protected before the Second World War. There are some pioneering sites that became shadowed ancient monuments in the 1920s and 30s. But post-Second World War, there's at least three stages, of which Ironbridge is a very good example. So you've got the drive in the 50s and 60s as the big industries collapse and close. You've got the drive to preserve what you can, which is where Ironbridge, a lot of Ironbridge comes in, as the railways close and the ironworking, manufacturing close. So if you like, there's a sort of sense of we've got to preserve these sites because they're heroic. They're part of the heroic story. This is of industrialisation. And then there's the next stage where you see this at the end of towards the end of the 20th century, where smaller scale sites are being preserved, where that idea of the sort of heroic individual is sort of pushed to one side in the background, and it's more about how do you preserve these sites as working objects. And quite often you have, well, Ben mentioned this, you've got the retired generation who actually ran those kind of machines still available to pass on their skills to the next generation. Again, we saw this at Ironbridge. And now we're into what I would say is the third stage in the 21st century, where we are 2 or 3, perhaps 4 generations on from the closure of those industries. There is, do we create, which we're trying not to make mythologies around how good the past was, or indeed how bad the past was. There is a temptation to do both as we've moved into a period when it's your grandparents or great-grandparents who were involved in that industry. And that's really part of what I think Ironbridge at the moment we're feeling our way towards, how we approach that for the new audiences of the 2020s
and beyond.
And for the diverse societies that we've become in the post-industrial world, and we can be relevant to all of those, but we have to think about how we do that without mythologising.
Brilliant, thank you.
I can do the iron and china one.
Yeah, brilliant.
So we hold a china collection, a Coalport china collection, as well as an iron collection, and people are equally in love with either or both, and no one can see kind of the beautiful cast iron halves and things without appreciating them. But there's also the little bits which are just as tactile and just as nice and as the china thing. So yeah, since we hold collections of both, they are equally as loved.
And there is something about that kind of romance of touching as
Absolutely.
well. That is a really important way of an immediacy of kind
it's
of
the
access
tactile
and feeling.
collections.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Tim.
What was the first question?
I think that was the first question, wasn't it? Or
That was the first question.
that was the first question.
The second one was about, is society sufficiently engaged with or even aware of heritage and its purpose and value?
Yeah.
Oh, that's. I mean, okay. I'll try and talk a bit about that. But I would also say the other thing about Ironbridge and Coalbrookdale, of course, is it was literally romanticised.
Absolutely.
At the time.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
but still, I mean, So the. I'm forgetting this question again. What's wrong with
Heritage value.
Heritage value, right? Yeah. So I don't think we're living in a period in which people are forgetting about heritage. I think quite to the contrary. I think heritage and the past are more popular, perhaps I would dare say, than they've ever been. And it remains the case that you don't have to go all that far. Oh, you do have to go back a couple of hundred years. But you don't have to go that far back into the past to find a time when no one really bothered about much of this at all. And in fact, it's telling that heritage itself is a product of the Industrial Revolution. It was in the Industrial Revolution, during this period, during the 19th century, that people started to care about the past, started to be bothered about what was lost. And you suddenly didn't get public schoolboys writing on the throne in their names and so on and so forth. And I don't think we're in a position where that's disappearing. But I think it's a different question if we start thinking about whether people sort of understand, in a sense, what heritage is for, and perhaps ascribe what values they ascribe to it. I'm not sure if I understand what different people understand as being heritage and what the value of heritage is. But I'm certainly sure that people don't understand. Not everyone understands heritage in the same way that I do. So I think that there's an open question, and in a sense, that's why I think we need to understand heritage as something which needs to be open to change, because the value of heritage is not a static category, but is something that changes with each generation as we move further away from different pasts, as people start to create their own memories of heritage, their own memories of these sites, having visited them as school children. Those become really important rites of passage for many children going to heritage sites, and that sets up a whole sequence of events in which these heritage sites do start to change, and the memories that become associated with them do start to change. And we need to be careful. I suppose this is one of the risks, I think, of romanticising sites, is that they start to become static, and we start to lose a sense in which we're allowed to tell the story of sites post-heritage. Post the point where they stopped working. And then I think there is danger of mythologising and romanticising. So I think there are, again, I don't know whether people agree with me on that, but I think there is a sense in which how far
That's really helpful. Thanks.
heritage has value and what that value is something that's subject to change.
Kerry, did you want to come in?
I haven't got an awful lot to add, obviously, but I should stress again that my research specialism is Quebec, not the UK or England, but I just wanted to pick up again on those points about the open and dynamic nature of heritage and link it perhaps to something you were saying, Abby, about diversity in the Quebec context. I mean, this isn't my point, this is another colleague's point. One of the reasons I wanted to do my project was to challenge some popular narratives that we have in Quebec around how outside of the multicultural city and ethnically diverse city of Montreal, Quebec is pretty white. That is not true in the present, and it was not true in the past. And in fact, it was often the case that when these regions were more industrialized, there were more people of color in the regions because the work was there. So I think those are really important memories to think about as part of a living heritage.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you. I think we can take probably one question from the room if anybody has a question that they want to put to us. Nick?
Of course you do.
Yeah, just thinking about heritage reuse.
There's just
There's
a mic coming
just
for
for
you.
the online audience.
Hi, is that better?
Yeah,
there we go.
that's
So,
great.
I was just going to ask a question about heritage reuse and whether, you're saving. We have got a number of structures, as Abby said, that are historically significant, but they could be in the middle of nowhere. So there's no chance of reuse, and little chance in a way of interpretation, because you can't see them. It's very very difficult to get to them. So, are they worth saving? Is a question. And I'm interested as well in the example you gave, Mike, about the engine that was saved. Are you actually demeaning the importance of that object through giving it a different meaning, like you mentioned?
Okay, right. I'll take the engine first. No, I don't think you are demeaning. I think you're giving it added meanings and added layers. But actually, in the case I cited there, it's a central focal point of the reuse of that space. And if it wasn't reused in that way, the engine would disappear. It would go. So reuse is not just about reusing the structures. It's about reusing I would argue, reusing how we think about those sites. So to tie that into your first point about a hump or a bump or a ruin in the middle of nowhere, and we have quite a few of those, in the Ironbridge landscape. There's a health and well-being agenda around there. We could bring people out into what seems to be the middle of nowhere, and as part of that exploration of the landscape, with those static objects actually fitting in the landscape and having more meaning that way. I think that partly comes back to how we could imagine heritage going forward and using some of the new technologies in order to do that. In fact, in many cases, many of these isolated industrial monuments are more accessible than they've ever been because of the way our society works now in terms of transport networks and how we get around the landscape. But it's absolutely right to ask both those questions, because whilst it's important that heritage structure is given new use, we do have to respect how those spaces and objects fit together, and it's also important in thinking about how we can widen access to heritage, because there are thousands of really important technical heritage monuments that are difficult to get to, and it would be fantastic to bring more people to them. And how we do that are ways we can explore. Maybe we should bring the sites to them.
Yeah.
I think that move towards future exploration, I think that's a really good point on which to conclude. I'm also mindful of the fact that we're at 7 just after, and that's the time that we've advertised particularly for our online audience. So I do think that's an excellent question, challenging question, and an excellent kind of future projection on which to finish. Can I take this opportunity to thank Ben, Mike, Abby and Kerry for their very powerful and contemplative reflections. And can we just join them with a round of applause? And can I also thank the online audience for their engagement, for their questions, and we look forward to seeing you at an ILAS or KISI event at some point in the future. Thank you so much for joining us.